Great. So first of all, a bit of housekeeping. Please put yourself on mute and turn your cameras off until we get to the Q&A. I should just say we're now approaching the end of the first term of these lectures. So we've got a big bank of podcasts, videos already building up on the International Development Department website. So please go and check those out. Next week, we have a lecture on the International Day of People with Disabilities, and appropriately, it's on disability development, rights and inclusion, with a former student of James and mine, Tehas Clark, who will be speaking from Ethiopia, Musharraf Hussain, who's done fantastic work on disabled people's organizations. Just to say, some people may know there is a strike going ahead on that day, but we are going to go ahead with the lecture because it is the day of the disappeared, and because Teras has kindly agreed to come in from Ethiopia virtually for it. So we're going to go ahead with that. Right, let's get started. My name is Duncan Green. I'm Professor in Practice in the Department of International Development. I'm chairing tonight. We are recording, including the Q&A, so please be aware of that. You will be able to ask questions in chat in the Zoom and YouTube, but if you would rather do so anonymously, please private message James Putzel. And if you are given to tweeting, please tweet using the hashtag Cutting Edge Issues, which is the name of the whole series. Right, that's enough puff. Let's get going on the actual substance of the day. Today's topic is COVID-19, corporatization and closing space. The triple threat to civil society in India. Very hot topic right now, both in India and globally. The impact of the pandemic on civil society, which was already under threat prior to the pandemic. And we've got two great speakers to bring us up to speed on this. Our main speaker is Ingrid Srinath, who is the founder director of the Center for Social Impact and Philanthropy at Ashoka University, the first academic center in South Asia to focus on these issues. CSIP has produced path-breaking research on philanthropic flows, the impact of changes in foreign funding and of COVID-19, the non-profit ecosystem and regulatory reform, besides providing world-class capacity building programs for non-profit leaders and young people starting their careers in the non-profit CSO sector. And then to discuss her presentation, we have one of our own, David Lewis, who's Professor of Anthropology and Development in the Department of International Development at the LSE. He's written extensively on NGOs and civil society in Asia, including in Bangladesh and the Philippines. He has a growing interest in representations of developments in popular culture, including mission, fiction and film. Sorry, what am I talking about? Music, fiction and film. And is a faculty advisory group member in the LSE South Asia Centre. So Ingrid is going to speak for about 45 minutes. And then we're going to have David for about 10 minutes. And then we'll go to Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Ingrid. Take it away.
Thank you, Duncan. And thank you, LSE DID, for having me today. Today in India is what we celebrate as Constitution Day. It's the day that our Constituent Assembly, the Constituent Assembly of Free Independent India, adopted our Constitution in 1949. It's therefore sort of doubly sad that earlier this week, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, IDEA, rated India as the backsliding democracy with the most democratic violations during the pandemic. This was in its 2021 report on the global state of democracy. The violations they reported include harassment, arrests, and prosecution of human rights defenders, activists, journalists, students, academics, and others critical of the government or its policies. They also cited excessive use of force in the enforcement of COVID-19 regulations, harassment against Muslim minorities, internet obstructions and lockdowns, particularly in Kashmir. Sadly, again, this is not the only index on which India's democracy appears to be faltering. It echoes similar red flags in other global indices of media freedom, indices of freedom of religion, of civil society space and of internet freedom, among others. I want to share with you a short film that encapsulates some of the issues.
आज ही बच गए तो घर जाएंगे, नहीं तो मर जाएंगे तो रास्ते में रह जाएंगे। और पुलिस वाले एकदम गाली से बात कर रहा था। मजदूर आदमी को मतलब कुछ जिंदगी नहीं समझ रहा था, जानवर की तरह सलूक कर रहा था। वो गरीब के लिए जगह नहीं है। मान लो अब मेरा काम बंद हो गया तो कैसे मेरा बच्चा चलेगा, माँ खाएगा। अरे अरे देखो क्या हो गया। अरे अरे देखो क्या हो गया।
ऊंचे हिमालय से
Now, can this be heard?
कन्याकुमारी, धरती तुम्हारी, धरती हमारी, और ब्रह्मपुत्र से खंभात की खाड़ी, ये धरती हम सबकी है प्यारी। ऊंचे हिमालय से कन्याकुमारी, धरती तुम्हारी, धरती हमारी, और ब्रह्मपुत्र से खंभात की खाड़ी, ये धरती हम सबकी है मेरे भाई। जब हमने पकड़ी एक लंबी राह, तो ऊपर देखा खुला आसमान, और नीचे देखी सुनहरी वादी, ये धरती हम सबकी है प्यारी। जब चलते चलते कदमों को तकते पहुंचे सुनहरी गंगा के तट पे, चारों तरफ से आवाज आई, ये धरती हम सबकी है मेरे भाई। लेकिन इस गंगा में बहती है लाशें, शमशान घाटों में मोटों की कतारें, चारों तरफ से मौत की आवाजें, ये धरती उनकी भी थी प्यारी। ऊंचे हिमालय से कन्याकुमारी, धरती तुम्हारी, धरती हमारी, और ब्रह्मपुत्र से खंभात की खाड़ी, ये धरती हम सबकी है मेरी माई। ना रही नौकरियां, बंद हुए रोजगार, किसान भी रो रहा, कर्ज से वो दब रहा, और बच्चे भूखे ही रोते रोते सो गए, ये धरती हम सबकी है बहना। बेकारी से बेबस मजदूरों की वापसी, लंबी कतारें, पैदल सवारे और चल प्यारी चारों तरफ है फैली उदासी लेकिन वो इसको मानते नहीं कहते हैं बार बार सब कुछ तो है सही ये धरती हम सबकी है प्यारी चारों तरफ है फैली निराशा लेकिन वो इसको मानते नहीं कहते हैं बार बार सब कुछ तो है सही ये धरती हम सबकी है प्यारी ऊंचे हिमालय से कन्याकुमारी धरती तुम्हारी धरती हमारी और ब्रह्मपुत्र से हम हाथी भाई ये धरती हम सबकी है मेरे भाई ऊंचे हिमालय से कन्याकुमारी धरती तुम्हारी धरती हमारी और ब्रह्मपुत्र से हम आगे भाई ये धरती हम सबकी है मेरी भाई ऊंचे हिमालय से कन्याकुमारी धरती तुम्हारी धरती हमारी और ब्रह्मपुत्र से खंभात की खाड़ी ये धरती हम सबकी है बहना
Right. Other things that happened this week. We heard our national security advisor, this is the highest ranking security official in India, describe civil society to new graduates at the police academy as the frontier of fourth generation warfare. He said the new frontiers of war, what we call fourth generation warfare, is civil society. War itself, he said, has ceased to become an effective instrument for achieving political or military objectives. They are too expensive and unaffordable, and so civil society is pressed into service to achieve those goals. Just one day previously, the highest ranking military official expressed satisfaction that citizens in Kashmir are now willing to lynch their fellow citizens if they suspect them of anti-national activity. How can killing a terrorist be a human rights violation, he asked. If there's a terrorist operating in your area, why should you not lynch him? In the same week, and this wasn't a particularly frenzied week by any stretch, Muslims have been prevented from praying in areas that are designated for their prayer. 50 Christian churches have been shut down in a state in central India. So that's just the week that just was. I think in sum, what I'm trying to convey is that Indian democracy and the pillars that support it are being rapidly eroded. And I suppose the logical question to ask then is, where is the resistance to this apparently inexorable decline? The farmers' movement scoring their victory with the rollback of those new laws after a year of protests and camping out on the borders of New Delhi has had some success. But other movements and civil society more generally appear to have been successfully stifled. What I'm going to try to do today is outline the confluence of forces at play that leads us to this current situation. It's axiomatic almost to say that any aspiring autocrat, any at least one worth the label autocrat, must ensure the neutralization or at least the significant weakening of the key pillars of democracy, of the media, of the judiciary, and of civil society. He or she must also ensure the co-option of big business. In India, the seeds of that process were sown over 4 decades ago during our infamous emergency, when then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi suspended democracy for 21 months after she lost an election. That is when the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act was first introduced, with the stated intent of preventing foreign influence in politics. 45 years later, political parties have very cleverly legislated themselves out of the purview of that act and turned it instead into a powerful weapon against civil society organizations. In fact, in a very bitter twist, the government in 2018 created a new instrument, entirely opaque, an electoral bond it's called, that actually permits unlimited, completely anonymous political contributions. Between their introduction in 2018 and July this year, an estimated rupees 7,900 crores, that's just under $1 billion US, has made its way to political parties in this entirely anonymous, unaccountable form. When data were last available, 76% of the bonds sold went to the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, and the bonds accounted for 60% of that party's total reported fundraising. This is just one step in this trend of hollowing out democratic institutions, which, as I said, was initiated in the mid-70s and started to accelerate in the early 1990s, when our economy was sought to be liberalized. That was when a buoyant, triumphalist business sector seized the high ground in public perceptions and in policy influence, feeding this narrative of private sector good, everything else slow, inefficient, ineffective. The UPA government, led by the Congress party that ushered in that phase of economic reform, was actually quite deeply divided in its views of civil society. The faction led by Sonia Gandhi, the then Congress party president, was actually quite receptive to policy input from civil society actors. And this, in fact, was what led to that wave of legislation that gave us the right to education, the right to information, the right to food, and the right to work, the beginnings in India of a rudimentary system of social protection. The more technocratic function, led by then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, saw NGOs as obstacles to their neoliberal economic model, which favored privatization and globalization. So large projects that were, for example, promoting extractive industries or nuclear power, where local communities were being evicted and adversely affected in multiple ways, became flashpoints for conflict between state and business on the one hand and civil society groups on the other. And the bogey of the foreign hand was resurrected, notably by Dr. Singh in 2012. When the Modi government took office in 2014, the trend escalated sharply. First in the crosshairs were activists who had sought justice for the victims of the 2002 pogrom in Gujarat that killed over 1,000 people, mostly Muslims. Mr. Modi had been the chief minister of the state when this happened. What happened with that targeting of activists is a pattern that is now standard operating practice. Frontline activists, people like Teesta Setalvad of the NGO Citizens for Justice and Peace, who was successful in, I think she got 121 convictions for perpetrators of the riots, including members of Mr. Modi's cabinet. Activists like Teesta have had the full might of the state deployed against them. Multiple cases are filed, their passports are impounded, their FCRA permits and tax exemptions are withheld, their bank accounts are frozen, and a vicious campaign of vilification is launched against them, their families, and everyone who supports them. When these instruments aren't successful, the government goes after their support system. Their funders, in this case, the Ford Foundation, their lawyers, and anyone else who's trying to extend them support, then becomes subject to harassment, intimidation, even prosecution. What these actions do is send a broad message, a clear, chilling message to everyone of the possible consequences of that kind of activism or even trying to support those activists. When the center I run, CSIP, studied the impact of the FCRA crackdown in 2017, none of the funders we interviewed were even willing to be quoted in the report. A lot has been said about FCRA, and most of the media attention has actually focused on international organizations like Greenpeace and Amnesty, who have challenged the government's actions in court. Indian organizations who adopt that approach, like INSAF and Navsarjan and People's Watch, actually suffer much harsher consequences even when they win their long drawn out legal battles, as all of them do. They become pariahs to the funding community. They see their organizations reduced to the bare bones, if not rendered entirely defunct. But even worse, what am I saying? Even more severely affected are the faith-centric organizations who choose mostly to just go quietly, leaving hundreds of thousands of Indians bereft of basic services in healthcare, in education, in livelihoods, and the like. The targeting of some European donors, for example, has decimated the NGOs that work with LGBTQ communities. Those NGOs, of course, get very little support from Indian funders. And beyond the FCRA, there are draconian laws like on sedition, on terrorism, which are now routinely deployed against all forms of dissent. Some of you may have heard of the Bhima Koregaon 16, who have now been imprisoned without bail for 2.5 years. One of them, the 84-year-old Jesuit priest, Father Stan Swami, died a few months ago, shortly after he was finally granted bail to be hospitalized for COVID. Other laws, such as the National Security Act, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, and Section 124A of the Indian Penal Code, permit practically indefinite incarceration without ever being brought to trial. These laws have now been used against students, against journalists, against stand-up comedians, against academics, and others for actions such as these: for celebrating the victory of the Pakistani cricket team against the Indian team in the recent T20 World Cup, for sharing jokes and memes on social media, for participating in peaceful protests, for journalists who are seeking to investigate violence against minority communities, or for those who have tried to question the official COVID statistics. In a whole other realm of assault on democracy, religious fanatics, or those who are exploiting religious sentiment for political gain, now routinely attack members of minority religions, their places of worship, and their businesses. In recent weeks, we've had calls for economic boycotts of Muslim businesses that have grown in both their frequency and their stridency. We have customers of rideshare apps and food delivery services who refuse to accept Muslim drivers or delivery people. 4 states, all with BJP governments, have passed so-called anti-love jihad laws. 3 other states have announced their intention to pass similar laws. What these laws posit is that there's an organized conspiracy of Muslim men luring Hindu women into marriage with the intent to convert them to Islam. This is what they call love jihad. Love jihad is only one example of how the language itself is being weaponized. You can hear this everywhere you go, from ordinary people. Hindus are in danger. Go to Pakistan if you protest because, if you don't like how things are here, maybe you'll prefer things there. Journalists are called prostitutes. NGO activists are called anti-national. Our Prime Minister prefers the term 5-star activist. Many of us are referred to as urban Naxals, where Naxal refers to members of a violent Maoist movement. Tukre Tukre gang, which in Hindi suggests that you are working to break up the country, and termites are just some of the epithets that are thrown around to otherize minorities, refugees, and dissenters of all kinds. What this does, of course, is legitimize violence against them. In today's India, you can be beaten to death on a public thoroughfare for refusing to chant a Hindu slogan. You can be beaten to death anyway after you agree to chant that slogan. Mobs, offline and online, are determining what movies can be made, what books can be published, what food can be sold and where, what TV commercials are aired, indeed, what models in TV commercials may wear or not wear. It is no longer feasible, even in philanthropy, for grant applications to include words like human rights or governance, or even the word accountability, I found recently. On the legal front, the withdrawal of Article 370, which accorded special status at independence to Jammu and Kashmir, which happens to be India's only Muslim majority state, the Citizenship Amendment Act, which is a law that discriminates among refugees based on their religion, the law that seeks to create a new national register of citizens that threatens to strip millions of their citizenship, laws against religious conversion, laws that legislate food consumption, laws that seek to prevent interreligious marriage, are all feeding this resurgent majoritarian nationalism that is in complete contrast to the constitutional values that we are meant to celebrate today. Enabling these grave miscarriages of justice is a range of deeply compromised judicial and law enforcement institutions. In Mumbai, where I live, for the last couple of months, a game of political cat and mouse has been playing out, in which law enforcement agencies are being used to settle political scores. Our erstwhile commissioner of police was, till yesterday, a fugitive from the law. The erstwhile home minister, whom the commissioner had accused of corruption and extortion, is in prison. Officers at the Narcotics Control Bureau are being investigated for alleged extortion based on accusations by another minister. Across the country, tax authorities, intelligence bureaus, and criminal investigating agencies are now being routinely pressed into action against journalists, activists, NGOs, and academics whose activities the national or the state government finds discomforting. The erstwhile Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was accused of sexual harassment by a member of his staff. This gentleman then presided over the inquiry into the allegations against him, an inquiry that, by the by, exonerated him of wrongdoing. This is the sort of farce that is tainting and discrediting not only him, but the entire judicial establishment, especially because his judgments then go on to overwhelmingly favor the government, and he gets nominated to the upper house of parliament when he retires from the bench. On the other hand, bureaucrats, judges, police people who fail to comply with the government's expectations are summarily transferred to undesirable jobs or locations. Universities, too, are sought to be bludgeoned into silence. Textbooks are being rewritten to magnify the accomplishments of some communities and erase others. And media houses are either rewarded or targeted based on their willingness to toe the line. So these legal and extra-legal measures are combined with harassment, intimidation, routine threats of rape and the like by armies of trolls, again, offline and online, resulting in the worst cases in assassination of journalists, of rationalists, and allegedly even of judges. On top of this came COVID-19. And you just saw those scenes, migrant workers walking hundreds of kilometers, desperately trying to reach their homes and families, reduced to penury overnight by this draconian lockdown that was announced at less than 4 hours' notice. chronically under-resourced public health and social protection systems that buckled under the strain of the numbers, everything from food and oxygen to ICU beds, healthcare staff, protective equipment, even crematoria and cemeteries in dire short supply. The role that India's nonprofit sector and its citizens played in alleviating this distress and saving countless lives by providing critically needed healthcare, livelihood support, as well as by just shining a light on the plight of the most marginalized groups has of course been universally recognized, including by senior figures in this government. So this piece, the nonprofit sector stepping up, may not have been very different from occurrences in other countries where civil society found itself having to compensate for gross inadequacies in public health systems or for inadequate social safety nets. What was unique in India, however, was the total exclusion of the nonprofit sector from any of the official relief packages, which were meager enough, which the government offered to industry, to small-scale enterprises, and to other sectors to help them tide over the crisis. At a time, for instance, when countries from Canada, the USA, and the UK, two countries like China and Russia, were extending support to NGOs by way of increased tax incentives for philanthropy or job protection schemes for their staff, India's nonprofits instead found themselves competing with our Prime Minister, who launched a brand new fund called the Prime Minister's Citizen Assistance and Relief in Emergency Situations, or PM CARES Fund, which offered a higher tax write-off than NGOs are permitted to offer. It permits business to meet the compliance requirements under India's CSR law, and it provided unlimited access to international funds, besides, of course, dangling the possibility of earning goodwill with the powers that be. It was not clear at all why this fund was even necessary, given that there was already a perfectly functional Prime Minister's National Relief Fund and Chief Minister's Relief Funds in most states. Furthermore, this fund is like Schrodinger's cat a little bit. It's fuzzy. When it needs to attract contributions, it has all the trappings of an official government entity. But somehow, when it comes to access to under right to information laws or mandatory audits that are required of government funds by the Auditor General, somehow this fund morphs and becomes an NGO. In another piece of the COVID story, as Indians were dying in their hundreds for lack of oxygen, there were plane loads of ventilators and oxygen concentrators that were ready to fly these into India from overseas. Even in that situation, our government refused to relax the provisions of the FCRA, a practice that has actually been quite commonplace in previous national disasters. Then, as if this was all not enough, the government chose this time to introduce new amendments to the FCRA. Amendments that further constrain access to international support, limit the uses to which such funds may be put, and present a host of other obstacles, including a requirement for some reason to route all these funds through one particular branch of the State Bank of India in New Delhi. It's mystifying because transfers by way of foreign direct investment to business amount to more than 16 times the amount of money that NGOs receive from overseas donors. Those FDI flows, just as susceptible to misuse one would imagine, attract no similar hurdles, no scrutiny, and can be banked in any bank anywhere in India. In another thing that's noticeable about these particular amendments, they follow this new pattern where legislations are rushed through Parliament, in this case in 72 hours, with neither prior consultation nor deliberation or scrutiny by members of Parliament. The amendments were then approved by the President in 3 days and made effective instantly, throwing donors, NGOs, budgets, plans into complete disarray just at the time when all these resources, financial and human, were already stretched to their utmost. The International Commission of Jurists, commenting on these amendments said, the legislation fails to comply with India's international legal obligation and constitutional provisions to respect and protect the rights to freedom of association, expression, and freedom of assembly. They stressed that the bill's provisions would impose arbitrary and extraordinary obstacles on the capacity of human rights defenders and other civil society actors to carry out their important work. They further warned that this hasty lawmaking clearly undermines human rights and the work of civil society and is yet another attempt by the government to destabilize the functioning of democratic institutions in India. The International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, on the other hand, observed the amendments are disproportionate and unwarranted restriction on Indian civil society, and they have only served to debilitate the global, national, and local response to COVID-19. And as if this wasn't enough, at the same time, changes were made to the CSR rules requiring new registrations to qualify for funding, new renewal requirements for tax exemptions, which also went into effect at the height of the pandemic. And so NGOs were scrambling to somehow, during a lockdown, get signatures and affidavits and board resolutions and a plethora of other paperwork completed, even as they were trying to keep their staff safe, serve their communities' surging needs, and deal with the consequences of donors redirecting their resources en masse from regular programs to COVID relief. It's worth noting here that the parliamentary processes I just described are far from the exception. They are part of now an obvious trend towards bypassing both consultation and parliamentary scrutiny when legislation is being drafted. In 2014, just when this government came to power, a new policy was adopted called the pre-legislative consultation policy, which mandates a host of things, including that whenever a law is made, a draft version of it must be placed in the public domain for at least 30 days. Since the inception of the policy, 227 of the 301 bills introduced in Parliament have been presented without any prior consultation. Of the 74 that have been placed in public domain for comment, at least 40 did not adhere to the 30-day deadline. By comparison, the 2 terms of the UPA government that preceded this government, when this policy did not exist, saw 60% and 70% of the bills in the 2 terms discussed by parliamentary subcommittees. In this government, those percentages have dropped to 25% and 10%. One other thing that the pandemic threw into sharp relief were the inadequacies of India's philanthropy and civil society ecosystem. The lack of functional national associations of funders or of NGOs means that the sector has no voice in policy debate, no mechanisms to share information or to coordinate action, no means to push back against new regulations, or even, in fact, to just get clarity about them. Similarly, the ecosystem lacks providers of services like research, recruitment, legal advice, financial advice, strategic advice, communication support, skill building, all of which go to hamper the sector's capacity to build scale, sustainability, and resilience. The new FCRA amendments pose additional hurdles for organizations that provide those kinds of services. What they do is they cap something they term administrative expenses to 20% of the value of FCRA grants. Expenses like program design, program management, even report production by a research organization is seen as an administrative cost, which makes it virtually impossible for these kinds of organizations to receive international grants. It's not helpful, of course, that tax incentives for domestic philanthropy have also been progressively whittled away under this government, leaving India with one of the most parsimonious regimes of tax incentives anywhere. You may not be surprised to learn that both Russia and China currently offer donors more generous tax incentives for philanthropy than India does. So this maze of legal and regulatory restrictions and the number of different agencies that have regulatory authority over the nonprofit sector means that NGOs of all kinds find themselves mired constantly in these complex, onerous, and often contradictory compliance requirements. Of course, none of these regulatory authorities is required to explain their arbitrary actions, and there is little, if any, redress or appeal available. Given then the severe consequences of any alleged breach of these rules, it's not surprising that we've been reduced as a sector to one that paints well within the lines, rather than risk potential consequences. For example, in 2020, the Supreme Court clearly ruled that just participating in a protest does not make your organization an organization of a political nature. Those kinds of organizations are not allowed to receive FCRA funds. Despite the Supreme Court ruling, the overwhelming majority of NGOs and funders, more importantly, have chosen to steer clear of any activity that might have the remotest possibility of attracting adverse attention. You don't even have to violate an actual law to attract this kind of attention. The police is increasingly prone to ignoring judicial orders and has been reprimanded multiple times by the courts for doing so. It continues to charge citizens with provisions of the law that do not apply. So for example, with the infamous Section 66A of the Information Technology Act, which has clearly been ruled out of existence by the courts, continues to be applied to attract random charges of sedition, waging war against the state, causing offense to groups of people, and portraying authorities or the country itself in a poor light. And actions that, like these, that limit freedoms of expression, association, and assembly online now mirror those that restrict them offline. We have, as a country, the world record for extended internet shutdowns, especially but not limited to Kashmir. We now shut down the internet when school exams are on to prevent children from cheating in exams, apparently. There is continuous legal and extra-legal pressure on social media organizations to censor posts and to censor posters. And of course, now the new revelations about the alleged use of the Pegasus software for illegal surveillance or to plant evidence on activist devices, or both, is one of the more egregious instances of this phenomenon. As we speak, data protection, intermediary liability, and the ever-growing reach of our biometric identification system, Aadhaar, continue to be battled in court in a game of what can best be described as legal whack-a-mole with the authorities. They promulgate rules that exceed the legislation's purview. They're challenged in court. They lose that battle. They go 5 days later, there's a new rule that in some other way tests the boundaries of these legislations. The internet is particularly important in India because mass media ownership here is concentrated among a few big business people, not unlike other countries, and the airwaves and broadsheets are dominated by very strident, very loud cheerleaders of the government. In this context, the internet provides almost the only somewhat free space. So these attempts to regulate and censor it are particularly ominous. But corporate media are only one part of the growing encirclement of our society by corporate interests. For civil society, for example, you could be on the one hand trying to combat powerful businesses, often allied with the government, where you're trying to defend the environment or human rights. But simultaneously, you're confronted with a funding landscape in which funding from business is the main source of philanthropic support because international funding is choked off. Section 135 of the Companies Act which is popularly known as the CSR law, is a policy unique to India. It requires all companies above a certain size to contribute 2% of their net profits to social impact causes. Its impact on philanthropy and civil society in India has been interesting. On the one hand, it's probably double the absolute volume of corporate philanthropy. On the other hand, the law is designed to prioritize short-term, easy-to-measure, employee-pleasing programs over the more long-term, more complex, harder to measure, less photogenic causes. Another thing it did, interestingly, was shift agency, repositioning the corporate donor as the main protagonist and the NGO now as a mere implementing agency. Critically, of course, it has now created a significant disincentive for any NGO to be perceived as critical of business in any way. One other effect it has had is to accelerate and amplify this preference for business people on NGO boards and in leadership positions in NGOs. So you now have this market orientation pervading all aspects of NGO functioning, from the kind of intervention. So we're seeing a preference, for example, for technology-driven programs in education, as opposed to ensuring the right to free public education. We're seeing a preference for microcredit and other forms of financial inclusion rather than dealing with entrenched caste and gender discrimination. We're seeing a focus on low-cost service delivery programs rather than on the defense and promotion of rights. Fear, or the possibility of favor, also means that CSR funds follow the Prime Minister's current whims. So one year we're all building toilets, another year we're funding the building of the world's largest statue, and who knows what's next. Finally, just prior to the introduction of the CSR law in 2013, India was witnessing a groundswell of debate around business responsibility for human rights, around environmental standards, even went as far as quotas for socially marginalized groups in the private sector. All of these have not so mysteriously fallen silent since the introduction of the CSR law. We're now proposing a new social stock exchange, which will define social impact even more narrowly and superficially than the CSR law does. So this large-scale corporatization of mindsets really cleaves the sector in two. There are good NGOs who are welcome in public-private partnerships, and then there are the black sheeps who must be eliminated by any means necessary. It's interesting as a contrast that while laws and policies that govern the private sector have been thoroughly reformed over the past 2 decades, with a particular focus on improving India's ranking in the ease of doing business scores of the World Bank, no similar action has been taken to rationalize or simplify the regulatory frameworks for civil society, despite multiple task forces being constituted and multiple policy documents being drafted. CSIP itself was commissioned by the National Policy Think Tank to review all policies that affect civil society and to propose self-regulatory mechanisms. Our reports were much appreciated and applauded, but the only changes in policy that we've seen actually work in the polar opposite direction to the ones we recommended. India, as you know, has very large development and social challenges to address. We have squandered too many years of rapid economic growth without making the investments in education, in healthcare, in social protection that might have helped to reduce hunger, illiteracy, discrimination, exploitation, inequality, and the impact of the climate crisis. Those investments could also have helped us minimize the impact of COVID-19, and they could have encouraged sustainable growth after the pandemic. The pandemic itself presents new opportunities for a reset. To give us, it's opened up the policy space, if you will, to make those investments in radical new policies in public health, in education, in urban development, in public housing, in labor rights, and environmental protection, and a range of other areas. Instead of making those investments, India is sliding quite rapidly down a slippery slope into majoritarian authoritarianism, with the key institutions of democracy hobbled, stifled, and co-opted. Each day brings news of more activists detained, more NGOs in distress, more impunity for crimes against minorities, more politicians inciting violence, more victims of violence being prosecuted, more dire prospects for equality before the law, and more assaults on rights and freedoms. It's only the courage of a few activists, a few NGOs, a few grassroots groups, some journalists, and the occasional judge who chooses to uphold the Constitution, plus everyday acts of bravery and compassion by our fellow citizens that are currently holding our democracy in some stead. These individuals and organizations need every bit of support that we can find in ourselves to provide. So I ask myself almost daily, is the scenario one of unremitting bleakness? Can this slide be reversed or at least slowed? What needs to change? And I think there are three areas that must be addressed urgently. One, the regulatory framework that governs civil society in India need urgent and comprehensive reform. Regulations need to be rationalized, simplified, and made coherent. They need to be made fully compliant with both India's constitution and the international treaties to which we are signatories. They need to clearly recognize the entire range of services and roles played by the nonprofit sector, from service delivery to business watchdog, to government and media watchdog, to innovation incubator, to developer and upholder of norms, to advocate, capacity builder, and champions of citizens and citizenship. We need a system also of self-regulation with an independent regulatory body that could deregister, register, build capacity, disseminate information, report on the sector, and be charged with strengthening the sector as a whole. We have a model in use in our microfinance sector, which could be a template. And of course, models of charity regulators in other countries also offer useful templates. Second, these anachronistic draconian laws that muzzle free expression, assembly, and association must be repealed or read down through judicial action. Further, the freedoms that are protected in the physical world must clearly be equally protected in electronic media and on the internet. Third, governments in the states and at the national level must be held accountable for ensuring that participatory governance mechanisms and human rights watchdogs are fully staffed, fully funded, transparent, and independent. That's a pipe dream, you might tell me. Gaining traction on any of those will require a critical mass of Indian civil society organizations to coalesce, despite our many differences, around an agenda of building sector solidarity, reshaping the public narrative and the regulatory context. Indian philanthropy too has critical choices to make with regard to its priorities. Will it be content to play the role of enabling and legitimizing this erosion of core democratic principles, or will it make common cause with the defenders of constitutional values? Dare one hope for these shifts? One group that cut through the gloom and gave us all cause for optimism recently was the farmers' movement. I'll give them the last word. Thank you. One moment. Where is this?
We can't see anything, Ingrid.
Sorry?
We can't see anything.
Let me share screen.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry about that.
असा निकले छड़ सारी फिक्रा गांदे आए जालिम वापस जाओ 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 मिट्टी दे कण कण विचों है आंदे ऐही गूंज है जालिम वापस जाओ।
पहले भी कभी रोटियां बनाई थी ऐसे?
नहीं, ये तो मोदी सरकार ने बनवानी सिखा दी है।
सानू आके स्या काली रातां ऐही सवेर दी पुकार वापस जाओ 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 जागी अवामुल खैर मनाओ सब दी ऐही हुंकार वापस जाओ।
सुनेगा, सरकार को सुनना पड़ेगा।
बुलंद आवाज़ा कर दी ऐलाना अस्सी ठुकरान दे तुआनू वापस जाओ 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 तुहाडे इन काले कातिल कानूना दायको ही जवाब वापस जाओ।
जो किसान इधर है उनसे आकर मिलिए, उनसे पूछे कि उनको कितनी मुश्किल आती है, वो कैसे सोते हैं, कैसे खाना बनाते हैं।
असा निकले छड़ सारी फिक्रा गांदे आए जालिम वापस जाओ 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 मिट्टी दे कण कण विचों है आंदी ऐही गूंज है जालिम वापस जाओ जालिम जाओ वापस जाओ जाओ जाओ।
Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic. And I think we need an album of Indian covers of revolutionary hits sometime soon. Maybe David, who's a bit of a musician, can put it together. That'd be very good. That was a superb overview. It's had us chatting a bit in the chat bar about whether we can start thinking about working papers and things, because it was such a good introduction to an overview of the current situation, though deeply depressing, as you say. I'm now going to hand over to David. David, 10 minutes or so. You can take a bit more if you want.
No, I'll try and stick to 10 minutes. Thank you. Thanks, Duncan. And yes, that music made it a bit too late for our paper on music that we've just been working on, but it was very good. So thank you very much, Ingrid, for an incredibly informative and comprehensive, sweeping presentation. And there's so much food for thought there. Unfortunately, rather a depressing picture, and so much so I hardly know where to start. I mean, it's an alarming account of India as a backsliding democracy, and I think we've been witnessing this now for several years, but I think the way that more recently the pandemic has provided cover for a series of further and intensifying democratic violations and a bypassing of civil society is really troubling. I mean, it is, of course, part of a much wider picture in which governments around the world have been reining in the politically inconvenient civil society sector through a range of now familiar mechanisms. But I think it's really striking that you can draw our attention to the fact that Russia and China actually offer more incentives and perhaps more space to NGOs. And with the historical roots that you talked to us about notwithstanding, it also feels to me as an outsider only slightly familiar with India, it really feels like a dramatic break with the recent civil society past. And, without wanting to paint an excessively rosy picture of that past civil society landscape, I think it has always been one that's seemed quite impressive to outside observers anyway. I mean, certainly in the small amount of work that I've done in, in past decades, where there's a civil society sector with the influences of Gandhian philosophy and activism and strong traditions of local voluntarism and long-standing productive relationships between international NGOs and Indian NGOs and local Indian NGOs as well. There was a whole lot of things going on around service provision, around advocacy, around innovation. There was a piece that I read a few years ago by Apurva Oza of AKRSP, the Aga Khan Rural Support Program, where he talks really interestingly about the influence of civil society on government policy. He said almost any government program worth its salt came from an innovation in civil society, and he draws attention to the National Rural Livelihoods Mission and the influence of Myrada in the past and self-help groups, the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme that was lobbied for by civil society, integrated water management program, watershed management. There's a huge history of this stuff. And then in the campaigning field, there's the Narmada Dam campaign over so many years that was an internationally known and, of course, locally important example. And the right to information movement that you mentioned that's sort of spread to other countries in the region and also beyond. So, how we've gone from that into this situation where it seems that civil society organizations can neither be critical of government nor of business. It's almost the antithesis of what advocates of civil society call for. And I think there are some lessons for us more widely. I mean, I was particularly struck by your arguments about the corporatization of civil society that's effectively turned areas of it into a sort of depoliticized, marketized activity under the guise of CSR. And I think that's a very clear warning for those of us who see CSR as something that can be transformative. So I've got a few questions that I'd love to open up, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on. I mean, one of them is the fact that you've given an incredible overview of what's happening, but obviously India is a very big country, and I wonder if there are regional differences that you could comment on, where perhaps there is there's more of a, more rays of hope. I mean, inevitably one thinks about sort of Kerala and other parts of South India, where there may be different political opportunity structures in terms of the openness of political arrangements or the stability of elite alliances or the presence of elite allies with involvements in civil society. So that was one question about locality and regions. I mean, on the farmer protests, I wanted to ask again, because I don't know too much about it, and I wanted to ask you, how much you feel we can read into these protests and the success that they've had in pushing back government policy. I mean, how much of it was about regional sort of landowner elites and large farmers, defending interests, or are they, a source of hope in that these can also be seen as bottom-up, multi-class movements that have, indisputably been effective in challenging marketization? So I'd love to know a little bit more about that. I was interested to know a little bit more about climate and environmental activism, and in particular, whether there are some generational areas or aspects of hope, really, where maybe younger people challenging the status quo or opening up the possibility of recreating or rebuilding a sense of civil society and reshaping the narrative. Another question I think that I'm interested in is links between civil society and state. Are there, one of the things that we sometimes look to civil society for is as a kind of sort of political training ground, a kind of, habits of democracy argument. And I wondered whether there is anything there around individuals who move between government and civil society, whether there are allies within this government who see civil society in more positive ways, or perhaps locally, if not nationally. And then finally, because I've given you an awful lot of questions to think about, do we need, and this is the big one, I suppose, do we need to rethink the assumptions that we have about civil society as an idea and as a vehicle for change? There's been an awful lot of discussion, and some would say naivety, about this very difficult concept or bundle of concepts, really, as we talked about in on our core course last week, actually, different versions of, or different ways of thinking about civil society. Have we been naive about civil society? So I think I've just about stayed within my 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, David. Well, David segued brilliantly into the Q&A by giving you your first 5, I think, by my count, questions.
Sorry.
Do you want to just come back on him? Other people, please, those listening, stick your questions in the chat and we'll come to you straight after this, although I've got loads of questions too, just because I work for Oxfam when I'm not working for LSE, so this has prompted loads of thoughts too. So if you don't want to listen to a bunch of old people arguing with each other, get your questions in the chat now. Over to you, Ingrid. I'm not including you in the old people. It's just me and David, I hasten to add.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Duncan. So if I can sort of take those questions in the sequence but before I go there, I think, so, a lot of these laws are not new, even though some of them have been amended, and a lot of these policies or even these tactics are not new. It's not as if the previous governments have, not adopted some of these same approaches. I think what has changed, and this is what makes it different, this is something you may relate to as well in your part of the world, which is there's a level of brazenness, a level of ruthlessness that has never been on display before. So there's a willingness to, not just buy an election, but buy an election publicly and visibly, without any shame or any attempt even to conceal what you're doing. And the second thing I think that's different about this time is how the majority community has been weaponized as a weapon of politics. I don't know whether you have anything, you certainly do with Brexit, but there's a way that those divides have been capitalized on to really become political instruments. So then coming to your questions, are there regional differences? Certainly there are. If you look at even during COVID, for example, the way Kerala reacted and their approach was very different from the way other states reacted. Sadly, they haven't actually been able to control the spread of the pandemic as well as one hoped they would. But what they did do was minimize its impact. So everything from, children who could no longer go to school were actually getting midday meals home delivered. and there was telephonic and online counseling available to people who were suffering from mental health issues and so on. So even when they weren't able to control the pandemic necessarily, policies like that, where there was strong partnerships between, and this was only possible because of the strength and width of the partnerships between government and civil society in Kerala. There are networks of women, for example, who are literally operate in every village in Kerala, who then became delivery mechanisms for some of these interventions. In other parts of the country, yes, there are differences, but the differences are inconsistent. So the same chief minister who's an ally on one issue would be an adversary on another. And it depends really on which constituency is speaking. So the farmers have particular clout in Punjab and Haryana, whereas Muslims have particular clout in Uttar Pradesh because they represent a significant chunk of the electorate there, and so on. So it really depends on how the politics can be sliced and diced that determines how bad or how good things are. On the farm laws themselves, I don't know whether I'm qualified to speak to the merits of the laws themselves. I certainly haven't studied them with any degree of rigor. But what I can say is two things. One is they're an object lesson in how not to legislate. They were first promulgated as an ordinance, even though Parliament was about to meet, and then they were sort of pushed through Parliament, shoved through Parliament with no debate, no scrutiny, and so on. And so even people who might have been allies of the government on this were put off by the fact that basic democratic principles had been violated, and they wanted to know why the government was, acting so precipitately. The other thing to note is that the farm laws are only the most visible such U-turn. Early in the government's tenure, they tried to pass a land acquisition law, which would allow the government to, through eminent domain, acquire people's land. That law was passed, but never implemented. They then passed this Citizenship Amendment Act a couple of years ago, which at the start of the pandemic, which was supposed to differentiate between refugees based on their religion. Never implemented. So not formally repealed, but just put into cold storage. The same with the National Register of Citizens. They've been threatening this new National Register of Citizens now for a couple of years. They launched a sort of pilot project in Assam, which didn't yield the results they wanted because, I can't remember now, 90 million Hindus ended up trapped in this law, which was not their intent. And so that's been put into abeyance. And similarly, the new labor laws and so on. So this government has actually conceded defeat a number of times in its legislative agenda. This is simply a very visible and very public defeat. And so it has a very different effect. It emboldens other movements. It kind of shows the way for what works and what doesn't. Effectively the government has said to people, if you can block the highways coming into Delhi for 11 and a half months, we will be left with very little choice but to concede your demands, which is not necessarily the best thing, the best message you want as civil society, but it's certainly going to have some consequences. On the climate question, and do different generations see this differently? Yes, broadly. Younger people are more engaged on climate and environmental issues. But what supersedes that engagement or that interest is this majoritarian nationalism. So regardless of your age, if you are a supporter of this Hindutva model of governance, then you're going to support the Prime Minister and this government on all their policies. You will contort yourself into ridiculous shapes to try and, in fact, make sense of. For example, with the repeal of the farm laws, right? There were these news anchors and journalists and young people who had been crying themselves hoarse about how the farm laws were the best thing that had ever happened. And then the prime minister does this U-turn, and they suddenly have to find a way now of supporting the prime minister's new position without actually going back on everything they've said. So this identity thing is superseding what issues I might actually feel deeply about. Somebody, I think, likened it to supporting a sports team, which is, it doesn't matter whether they win or lose, you're still a Man United or a Arsenal or an Indian cricket team or a Mumbai Indian fan. And so you have to support them. On the question of links between civil society and state, there's certainly an on-ramp, if you will, into politics from civil society. So you quite often have, there are people who've sort of gotten into politics through student politics, through trade unions, through cooperative movements of various kinds, in fact, previous governments have been very successful in co-opting movements by, in effect, drawing them into politics. So the students' movement in the Northeast, for example, which was one of the most ferocious anti-government movements that we had seen, and pretty violent too, was sort of persuaded, in a sense, or lured into becoming a political party, at which point they were completely neutralized. And there certainly are allies, certainly in the bureaucracy, and I'm sure in the parties as well. But nobody, at this point in time, nobody sort of publicly defends civil society, or very few people will, and maybe those people don't count as much. Should we be rethinking the whole idea of civil society? Probably. For the longest time, I think people have talked about this idea of uncivil society, and how not all civil society is sort of created equal and has the same laudable goals. And then, of course, as soon as you decide to prescribe what's a laudable goal and what's not, you sort of violate the basic tenets of what civil society is and how it should be. So it's a bit like censorship, which is, even when it's done in a good cause, it probably has worse long-term effects than the problem it is trying to cure. So I will stop there.
Right. I should have said at the beginning an extra thanks to Ingrid, because she's doing this at 10:30 at night or something very uncivilized. But we're going to keep you going because we have some questions, some questioners in the chat. So what I'll do is I'll tell you the three names that are coming up, and then we'll go to them in turn, and they'll come onto camera and onto mic and ask you the question themselves. If they have technical problems, I can always ask it for them, but it's better if they come on. So we're going to ask Merlin Fernandez, Shinzani Jain, and Hafsa Ahmed. Merlin, do you want to come on first and ask your question?
Thank you. Hi, Ingrid. Thank you for sharing your insights with us today. So at the end of your note, you briefly mentioned the social stock exchange, and I've been reading mixed reviews about the impact it might have on the nonprofit sector in India. And I wanted to hear your view on whether, there are two parts to my questions. So having all nonprofits and donors on one platform, will that lead to, let's say, unwelcome regulation of where the funds are going, and maybe perhaps holding the stakeholders responsible for, let's say, if donors are ending up supporting advocacy, will the government sort of use that as a measure against them? That's one part. The second is that given the country has about 3 million plus nonprofits, with most of them sort of working in rural parts and are really, really small, they might not have the capacity to cope with getting onboarded onto the social stock exchange or even meeting the reporting requirements. So do you think that's going to leave them out of the system and sort of further exacerbate the divide between the orgs which are based in rural areas versus urban areas?
Thank you, Merlin. We'll ask all three before you, if that's okay with you, Ingrid. So, sure. Shinzani, would you like to come on?
Hi, Ingrid. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I think it was absolutely apt and incredible that you ended with that video. And my question is in relation to that. So I think it's after a long time that a struggle has been overtly, outrightly successful in India. And I wanted to ask you what the view of the civil society in India is with respect to what lessons can be drawn from the farmers' movement, understanding the fact that the movement was composed of exceptionally diverse, ideologically diverse sort of groups, but who were together and fought for an entire year out there through all seasons, whether it's harsh winter or harsh summer. And if what are the lessons that can be drawn from the unity and the spirit of the movement, and whether you think that if in future it's really mass movements that hold any sort of, that will be acting as a harbinger of change in India.
Great question, Shinzani. Hafsa.
Sorry, I missed the last. I missed the last 30 seconds of what you said, Shinzani.
Just asking if you think that in future it will be mass movements, if that happens, that will bring about any sort of change in India.
Okay, and Hafsa.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. We actually did civil societies in my social policy and development class this week, so this is a very nice wrap up to my week. My question is about this whole sort of process of civil society or civil societies invoking international norms and discourses in any kind of advocacy that they pursue. And so from your experience, how might that work out in their favor, but also how might that create problems for them or challenge the advocacy that they do, perhaps using India, as an example? Thank you.
Great. Over to you, Ingrid.
Right. So to Merlin first, I have this sad confession. I was part of the technical committee that actually drafted the terms of reference for the damn social stock exchange. So for good or ill, I'm culpable on what it turns out to be. So the big positives or the potential payoffs of the social stock exchange are that it will attract new pools of capital to the nonprofit sector and to social enterprises. If it fails to do that, if it essentially cannibalizes resources that are already in philanthropy, then it will have just summarily failed. The second thing that it needs to accomplish in order to be seen as a success is that it needs to raise perceptions about the sector's credibility. This is what stock exchanges have done for business. If I look at the Bombay Stock Exchange and the National Stock Exchange, less than, I can't remember the number now, 0.3% of Indian companies are actually listed on the stock exchange. But those 0.3% listing creates an impression that the corporate sector is transparent, it's well regulated, it's a clean sector. And so even if very few organizations were to sign up for the social stock exchange, 3.1 million NGOs, maybe if 300 were to sign up or 3,000 were to sign up, that would still, I think, have that effect of raising credibility because of the impact reporting norms and the transparency and the ability of donors and civil society people to find each other. And the last positive of it is there's an instrument that's been created there, which is called a social venture fund, which is actually not, unlike a regular corporate stock exchange, where you would invest in a particular company. This is more like a mutual fund. So it allows many donors to pool their resources, and for those resources then to be invested in multiple nonprofits. So it's a many-to-many funding instrument. What this could do, in theory at least, is, for example, somebody could create a climate fund, and anyone interested in supporting activity that was going to save the planet could contribute to this fund. And the money could then be distributed to a range of organizations. It could be some that are frontline defenders of communities that are being affected by climate change, but it could also equally fund advocacy, research, a whole gamut of things. Now, if it works that way, it can be effective. How is the biggest fly in this social stock exchange ointment at the moment is the way social impact is being defined. The CSR law was already very limited. This has narrowed the definition even further. So topics like governance, accountability, human rights have all been left out. And so it can have the effect of attracting new resources. It can have the effect of improving the credibility of the sector, but it's unlikely to, for example, provide resources for activities like human rights defenders or that sort of stuff. So it's a mixed bag. It remains to be seen. On the inequality question, as I said, 0.3% of corporates are listed, and that doesn't seem to prevent medium and small scale enterprises and a whole range of corporate entities or business entities to continue to attract investment and to continue to operate. So there's no reason why you wouldn't see a similar or an analogous situation here, where certainly the early adopters would be larger, more corporatized NGOs, and then more mid-scale ones might follow or might benefit indirectly through one of these social venture funds. To Shinzani, what lessons are there from the farmers' movement and our mass movements, the future of civil society action in India? So civil society, I think the farmers had some unique things going for them. They were able to play quite well to the galleries in terms of both what they were protesting and how they were protesting. So that song, for example, was just one example of a range of communications and films and interviews that they've put out over the last 12 months, which have successfully positioned them as patriotic, oppressed people who are fighting big business rather than anything else. And that's sort of an argument that is emotionally resonant for many people. There's also this whole thing of, us, the providers of everything you eat, are now being sort of driven out of our own land and livelihoods. What's invisible to most of us is the level of coordination and organization that went into this. So it's really like you had with Occupy. You had a similar small core group that was really successful in not only determining what the messaging was going to be, but being able to, most of the time, manage and control the more unruly elements in the protest. So, for example, when one guy was murdered, that you might remember, they were very quickly able to distance themselves from the actions of those of their fellow protesters. So somebody at some point, like Aruna Roy has written the playbook on how they achieve the right to information. At some point, I'm hoping somebody will give us that detailed manual of how they actually coordinated this. And there were, as you know, some political parties involved, some trade unions involved, large numbers of ordinary citizens involved. But this core group that designed, managed, and held it together, and also played the role of interlocutor with the government. I think a lot of what we now call, these horizontal leaderless movements break down at the point where you now have to negotiate. These guys did that better than any Arab Spring movement, better than Occupy, better than a whole range of these big mass movements that have tried to effect change. They really had that negotiation, the representation and negotiation part figured out well ahead of time. So those were some, I think, of the success factors that are worth talking about. it's important, as I said, also to remember this wasn't the first. I mean, this anti-CAA protest, which was led by Muslim women in the main, but then attracted support from large numbers of people across the country, used very similar strategies. So there was the whole thing of women in the front line. There was, and these were clearly sort of ordinary women, exactly like the farmers, mothers and housewives and people with relatively little education, and so on. And so there was that emotive value, and who were, nursing their babies and, having to run home to cook lunch for their families. There was a fantastic emotional package built around that. And then the fact that this wasn't Muslims protesting for Muslim interests, it was Muslim women defending the Constitution and defending the Constitution's values. So they sort of they framed their protests really well. And they would probably have won were it not for COVID. It was really COVID that forced them, in a sense, to disperse and brought that protest to a close, and certainly limited it to smaller pockets. So I think there is a template that is emerging that can successfully be replicated. Of course, it will diminish with each replication. You can only use a formula X number of times before it becomes trite and formulaic. To Hafsa, the international question is a really interesting one. It can work both ways. I think this government is uniquely sensitive to international opinion when it comes from Western countries or Japan. Mr. Modi in particular reacts really strongly takes it seriously when criticism comes from his friends. They're less sensitive to reactions from international organizations. So the UN, for example, can shout itself blue in the face. They don't care. They're accustomed to ignoring the UN, and they'll continue to ignore the UN. But a particular vulnerability is the diaspora. What affects the diaspora affects this government disproportionately, again, because they count on the diaspora for a great deal of their support. So if Indians in the US or UK are saying this is not good for us, then there's a better chance that the international opinion will count. Interestingly, during the farmers' protest, one of the most successful interventions was not, people like the UN High Commissioner or anyone else speaking, but the tweet by Rihanna. That really got under their skin in a way that I could not fathom. So in some ways, this is really about tapping into almost every potential advocate or ally and just seeing which one works. Because I would not have predicted that it was Rihanna that was going to be the one that provoked a response. And it does. I mean, there is the easiest way to discredit a movement is to suggest that it's being funded by foreigners or being inspired by foreigners. And so you have to be really ultra cautious, particularly on the money. So if they can trace money back to international donors or to international organizations, then that will discredit the movement almost immediately.
Thanks, Ingrid. Comprehensive questions, comprehensive answers. Very good. We've got one question from Balthazar de la Ville Bourget and a question from Duncan Green. And then we'll go to, I think if it's okay, just so you wrap up, Ingrid, we'll then go to David for any final remarks, and then we'll come to you for answers to those questions and any final thoughts. Oh, wait a minute. Hafsa has just appeared with another question. So we'll go to her before me. Right, so Balthazar, do you want to come on camera?
Yes, hi. So my name is Balthazar. Thank you for this brilliant presentation. It was amazing. And as you know, so the COP26 saw India opposing a commitment to phase out coal while negotiating the final agreement, causing disappointment and concern over whether the world can limit the average global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. Could you maybe expand on the intersection between environmental sustainability and democratic backsliding in India?
Great, thank you, Balthazar. Hafsa.
Thank you. So I was just thinking about sort of the point about the corporatization of NGOs, and my question is that in becoming more business-like, do you think that NGOs are losing their soul in a way, which for me is all about changing systems, right? And so becoming more short-term goal-oriented, taking on more projects rather than long-term campaigning to change systems. Do you think that they've fallen into a trap of sort of perpetuating the very systems that they aim to?
Thanks, Hafsa. And couple from me. Ingrid, before you were doing what you're doing now, you were a sort of global civil society person. You were the CEO of Civicus. So could you get a bit comparative on this? Why do you think India has overtaken countries like Russia and China? The why rather than the what? What is it about India? Is it because of the level of civil society success prior to the current government, or is there some other factor at play? And then the second one is, in a lot of countries, government funding for COVID response through civil society organizations has turned them into service deliverers. You're saying that's not happened in India. So what's happened in terms of civil society advocacy around COVID, either anti-vaccine type activity or protection type activity? And that's the end of the question. So if you had a question and you haven't asked it, tough. You should have got in earlier. David, do you want to come in first, and then we'll give Ingrid the last word?
Thank you, Duncan. Yeah, actually, I'm still thinking about Hafsa's question actually as well, about NGOs losing their soul. I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think, well, everyone's got a different idea of what, the soul of an NGO should look like. And, that's what I think makes them interesting organizations, and it's what makes the whole sector potentially creative. So I would say that the diversity of different kinds of visions and versions of what NGOs should be is what's important, and that what we often see, and I think this might be a case, is this kind of monoculture where there's only one version, or there's a predominant version. And I think you're absolutely right that business-like version, there's only so much space that we really want for that version. We want some of the other versions. So, I think you're onto something there, but I don't think NGOs have a soul that they either have or lose. A couple of other just observations that I think maybe are relevant. I mean, one of them is that I think one of the things that we have learned about civil society in relation to bringing about change is that it's only when civil society groups have productive links with politics, with political parties or affiliates or political projects, that they have a chance of bringing about change. And so the sort of apolitical civil society, there's place for it, but it's not what's most important, I think. I guess the other observation is this sort of business state relationship in India that we've heard about. And I just wonder whether there comes a point where business starts to be adversely affected by the instability, the lack of diversity, the alienation of huge groups of people in Indian society from what's going on, and start to react and assert some kind of more inclusive vision of society. That, I mean, I don't hold my breath, but I wonder if that is something that maybe, Ingrid, you'd comment on. But thank you. I just want to say what an interesting presentation and great questions from everybody too. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, David. Ingrid, over to you.
I'll echo that. Great questions. So to Balthazar first, where is the intersection between environment or India's stances on the environment and democratic backsliding? I think that the linkage is that corporate linkage. The positions that India takes on the environment are not necessarily the positions that best serve the average Indian. They do serve, however, the interests of industry in India. And so it's really that nexus, if you will, between the corporate sector, big business, or certain, it's not even all of business, it's really a set of crony capitalists. There's a small coterie of business people that are particularly close to this government and who include, for example, Mr. Adani, who is a large coal operator. There's he also is. There's a particular. It's not a broad. This is pro industry. It's pro some particular business people. That where you're seeing this sort of corporate capture, if you will, of policy. To Hafsa on losing our souls. So scale and soul have always been, there's always been a tension, right? I mean, you want to sort of increase the footprint of your impact, and doing that requires you to grow bigger in numbers of people, grow bigger in geography, grow bigger in, get more specialized in terms of, now I need a marketing function and an HR function and a finance and a legal and a whatever else. And somehow doing that is certainly not as passion and vision driven as, the original bunch of committed activists. I think, you can see the transformation most vividly in organizations like Amnesty and Greenpeace, where you really start at one end of the spectrum and end up at a very, very, very far from where you started. So I think some degree of that is inevitable. I think we need to perhaps rethink the pathways to scale. I know Duncan wrote a blog post many, many years ago that included an organization that I worked in called Childline. And that, for example, is one pathway to scale that does not involve creating this large mammoth organization, with all the spiders sitting on other spiders in those organization charts. I think, so that's, there are, I think, alternate pathways to scale which perhaps allow you to retain that essence of your mission better, or have greater fidelity to that than the big corporate structure does. And there are multiple, if you go back to Duncan's blog post, you'll find there are multiple such pathways. But more recently, of course, it has been this particular pathway of the idea that I think somebody, I think I certainly first came across it in this book called The Spider and the Starfish, which sort of posited this model that the starfish, the authors claim, I've never verified this, I probably should, has no central nervous system. And so, any action the starfish takes needs to be one arm of the starfish decides it wants to head that way, it just starts heading that way. But unless the other four arms agree and move with it, the starfish, of course, doesn't move. And the same with feeding and other things. And essentially, he talks about this new kind of change-making organization, which is this more leaderless, where people are bound by a vision rather than by corporate structures. One really great example he talks about is Alcoholics Anonymous. This is a global organization with a chapter on practically every street corner, which has very little, if any, corporate structure. I mean, there is a global headquarters, but they certainly don't control what happens at the Al-Anon chapter down the road from me. All they have are these 12 principles and some broad ideas of how this approach works. And as long as you sign up to those principles, you are in effect Alcoholics Anonymous. So it's basically, it's a very long way of saying there are multiple pathways to scale, and there are ways to achieve scale without corporatization. And NGOs need to consider some of those rather than automatically going down the path of. To Duncan's question of Russia and China versus India. So first of all, I want to be clear, India is nowhere near as bad or as hostile to civil society as Russia or China is. The situation is many degrees worse in Russia and China than it is in India. We're still not as hemmed in and as constrained. I mean, you still have journalists regularly criticizing the government in print and on television. You still have stand-up comedians, taking the government on. You still have NGOs protesting, and I mean, I'm speaking to you today without too much fear that I will be disappeared or something like that. So the situation in India is definitely not as bad as it is in Russia or China. I think what the difference is that the decline in India has been much greater in a short period of time. So we're not yet as far down the road as Russia, China is, but we have shifted much further than they've sort of stayed where they are, whereas we've declined. On COVID and service delivery, there have been, so there's all kinds of NGO involvement or engagement on COVID. The government essentially fell down on the job on that one. They were just completely wrong-footed. And so it fell to private philanthropy, the corporate sector, and civil society, and just ordinary citizens to sort of step up. But now that, as things sort of stabilize a little, that who knows whether there's another wave or another variant coming, but for now, there's certainly strong partnerships between government and civil society on various kinds of service delivery. The biggest, I think, example of this is a program they call the Aspirational Districts program. So in this Orwellian fashion, we renamed the 100 and something least developed districts in India as aspirational districts. And there's sort of the focus of this really intense investment and attention. And those districts in particular are where you see the largest number and the strongest, deepest partnerships between philanthropy, civil society, and government across the range of development indicators. And it works pretty well, except of course that it's entirely apolitical. Which in a sense brings me to David's question, which is on the sort of apolitical CSOs. So I like to think of it as a continuum. I think you can be perfectly apolitical service delivery organization, but the data, for example, or the evidence that you provide might well inform a more policy advocacy type of organization that then works with a people's movement, for example, to build the political will you need to get that policy implemented. So I think there are differentiated roles there. Some of only the last mile of that, the building the political will part, is political. The previous stages of it can be actually quite apolitical. So, you can take data from JPAL and use it to advocate for universal basic income. And there's one part of it, which is the RCT part of it. There's one part of it, which is the policy advocacy part. And then there's the actual getting political action part. In terms of will business eventually start to see that this is bad for them? I think it's already starting to happen. Less publicly, of course, but and certainly it doesn't seem to have affected the fundraising numbers that the BJP is able to achieve compared to its competitors. But there's a lot of chatter in corporate circles around how this is bad for the country's image, how this is bad for foreign direct investment, how it makes them look bad to their foreign partners, and just a degree, I think, of squeamishness about some of the more just gruesome atrocities that have happened. I think overall business, the only thing business is really afraid of is uncertainty or volatility. Certainty, however bad it is, they're fine with. As long as they know what's coming, they can plan and design and price it into their models. It's when you have volatility, and that, if this government is not able to manage that aspect of it, then you could see some mass desertions of their business supporters.
Okay. Ingrid, we're going to let you go to bed, or whatever you want to do. I mean, you don't have to go to bed. David, Ingrid, that was a fantastic session, real tour de force. Honor to have you on this series. I'm going to have to go away and rewrite my course materials, unfortunately, now, for my course on activism. It is littered with positive case studies of fantastic achievements in India, which I won't take out, but I'm going to have to at least make the students listen to the podcast of you two discussing this, because it is a massive corrective to, I think we got a little bit overexcited or uncritical about what's going on. It also, for me, raised really profound questions about whether we've become too simplistic in this idea of there is state and there is civil society, and power is much more dispersed than that, and we need to go back to thinking, how do people come together to exert agency? It's not always through CSOs, and that's what we're seeing through a lot of the COVID experiences in many other countries. Anyway, this could go on all night, but we cannot. So thank you very much for coming. For those who have hung on to this point, come back next week for a discussion with Tejas Clark and Musharraf Hussain on COVID and disability. And otherwise, have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks very much. And Ingrid and David,